Can y'all hear me all right? Awesome. If you can remember all the way back to the first Sunday of August, I spoke to you about Daniel in Daniel chapter 1, and we talked about Daniel's resolve and how Daniel was taken into Babylonian captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar, and how Nebuchadnezzar tried as hard as he could to strip Daniel of his identity as a Jew and as a follower of God, and yet through all of that, Daniel resolved not to be defiled. We talked about how Nebuchadnezzar changed Daniel's home, his textbook, his name, and tried to change his diet. But in spite of Daniel's identity, we're told that Daniel refused to defile himself. This morning, I want to carry on with that idea as we progress through the book of Daniel. If you want to open your Bible to Daniel chapter 3, that's where the bulk of our time will be spent this morning. We've seen how God has been present in Daniel's life as a result of his resolve. We've seen how Daniel's resolve has led to Daniel being exalted and God being exalted through Daniel and the actions of him and his friends. And this morning we're going to see more of that as we see how God provides salvation for Daniel's friends in the midst of trials because of their resolve. From the moment that Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel and his friends into captivity, he's attempted to strip away their Israelite identity. If you remember, I made the comment or the quoted a book that said that Nebuchadnezzar was not interested in having hardworking Jews. He wanted these Jews to become Babylonians. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar works very hard to accomplish that, changing their literary and educational identities, forcing them to learn the wisdom and literature and language of the Chaldeans. We saw how Nebuchadnezzar tried to change their diets, and while Daniel and his friends will refuse to eat the king's diet, they will be instead fed vegetables and water, which is probably not what they would have normally eaten. We see how even their name is changed. But Nebuchadnezzar's not willing to stop there. He's not willing to rob them of just their physical identity as Jews and as Hebrews. In Daniel chapter 3, we see that Nebuchadnezzar seeks to strip them of their religious identity. Look with me at Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 1. We'll read through verse 7. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and breadth was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent and gathered the straps and prefects, and the governors and counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the straps, prefects, governors, and all counselors, treasurers, and justices, magistrates, and all of the officials of the province gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar set up, and the nations and languages, and the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. It's not good enough for Daniel and his friends to look like Babylonians and to sound like Babylonians and to act like Babylonians. Now Nebuchadnezzar wants them to worship like Babylonians. Brothers and sisters, this situation is not unique to Daniel and his friends. It's the same situation, the same troublesome situation that the church today faces. The world wants Christians to look like the world, to talk like the world, and to think like the world thinks, to eat what the world eats and to drink what the world drinks. And as if all that isn't good enough, the world wants us to worship the way the world worships. And if you look around, it's not hard to notice. If your family dynamic does not look like the family dynamic of the world, then you're an outdated traditionalist. If your love doesn't look like the love of the world, then you're an intolerant. It's not the one that uses foul language and dresses immodestly that stands out. It's those who are pure of speech, modest and chaste in their behavior and their dress that stands out in this world. And as if all this isn't good enough, the world wants us to worship like they do. A friend of mine said the other day that the world does not worship the God of love, rather they worship the God love. What he meant by that is that man no longer worships the God of heaven, the God of creation. Rather, man worships as God their twisted view of love. And they want us to worship that. The world around us worships materialism and individualism. They worship social justice and human philosophy. So is it any surprise, or rather, should it be any surprise, when the world despises the church? When they hate Christians and seek to take away the identity of God's chosen, or of God's people? The world hates us because we worship the God of heaven rather than the God of this world. We worship the God of love rather than the God love. We choose to worship the God of generosity rather than materialism. We choose to serve Christ and to be identified as Christians rather than to boast in our own individuality. We serve the God of justice and wisdom rather than the justice and wisdom of human philosophy. So much like Daniel and his friends, the world around us seeks to attack our identity. Specifically, they seek to attack our religious identity. Just as Nebuchadnezzar is seeking to change the system of worship that Daniel and his friends follow, the world around us seeks to change our own system of worship. They want to separate us from God and force us to conform to their worldview. So how do we respond? How do we respond to a world that is so dead set on taking away our religious identity? How did Daniel and his friends respond? If you remember back in Daniel chapter 1, verse 28, we're given Daniel's response to having his physical identity stripped away. Daniel's response is to have resolved not to be defiled. And if Daniel resolves not to be defiled when the king seeks to take away his physical identity, then you best believe that his response is to only double down in his resolve when the king seeks to take away his religious identity. Daniel wasn't going to let Nebuchadnezzar take away his physical purity, much less his religious purity. Daniel has resolved not to be defiled. And that extends to Daniel's friends as well. Daniel and his friends are going to stand out in the crowd. And if we're going to be able to stand firm in our faith in a world that seeks to strip away our religious identity, then we too are going to have to be willing to stand out in the crowd. Look with me back at chapter 3, starting in verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, Phrygian harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered to them and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? If you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, Phrygian harp, and bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship the golden image that you have set up. This is the response that the Christians ought to have. When the world seeks to strip away our religious identity, when they try to take away our God and replace our God with theirs, our response needs to be one of righteous stubbornness. We cannot give the world a single inch. Daniel and his friends certainly do not. And can you picture what that must have looked like? A crowd gathers together around this giant golden image, and the music starts to play. I can only imagine what it must have sounded like as this entire crowd of people falls down and bows down before this golden image. I think of when the song leader asks the congregation to stand up or sit down for a particular song. You hear that rustling of people taking whatever is in their lap and putting it aside and standing up or sitting down, just that noise of movement. I can only imagine that's what Daniel's friends heard as everyone around them fell down on their knees to worship this golden image. And in this crowd of who knows how many people, 3 men are left standing. 3 men stand up when everyone around them is laid down on the ground before this golden image. You best believe that Daniel's friends stood out in that crowd. As Christians, we ought to stand out in this world. When the world bows down to Satan, when everyone around us is worshiping that proverbial golden image, and we stand up, we ought to stand out in the crowd. We ought to look different. When the world is on their knees bowing before Satan and they turn and they see us standing above the crowd, we ought to stand out. Daniel and his friends did. Daniel and his friends stood out, and it made a difference. It had an impact. But is that the way the church looks? Because, brothers and sisters, it should be. When you drive down a street and every house has a rainbow pride flag or bumper sticker, except for one, that stands out. When you drive through a neighborhood on a Sunday morning at around 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's cars in every single driveway except for one, that stands out. When you walk into a restaurant and every table has pitchers and glasses of alcohol all over it, except for one, that stands out. When you go to work and everyone around you uses foul language, acts lewdly, but you don't, you stand out. When the world around you lives the life that Satan has put before them, but you choose to live the life that God has called you to, you're going to stand out. And standing out is tough, but it's important. As a Bible student and having lived on the mission field and been an active part of ministry for most of my life, I get a lot of comments from Christians who say things like, I'm not cut out to be a minister. I don't understand how you do it. I just can't do it. I'm not a good speaker. I'm not comfortable leaving my home and going to a foreign country. I just can't do it. Brothers and sisters, you don't have to. You don't have to come and stand in a pulpit to be an evangelist. You don't have to leave your home or your country. All you have to do is stand out in the crowd. Because when the world around you is bowed before Satan and you're left standing, people are going to want to know why. People are going to want to know why every Sunday morning between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. or noon, your car's not in your driveway. You work a 40-hour week, maybe a 60 or 80-hour week. You're a busy person. Sunday's when everybody's at home sleeping. Why aren't you sleeping in on Sunday morning? Everybody at work is having a conversation about who they're sleeping with or what they're doing this weekend, how wasted they got on Friday night. But you're not a part of the conversation. Why not? Why aren't you like us? Why don't you do what we do? That stands out. And the world notices. And it does give you a unique evangelistic opportunity to share your faith with others. The reality is that standing out is a tough proposition because the world around us seeks to knock down anyone who would dare stand out in the crowd. Society boasts tolerance and acceptance of all. That's not the truth when it comes to Christianity. Politicians may stand up and say we need to be more inclusive, but that doesn't extend to Christianity. The world around you is going to see that you stand out, and they're going to want to knock you down. They don't want to see you stand above them. But that's just what the Christians are called to do. You know, I find it funny that as Christians, we collectively refer to ourselves as the church. The biblical word that we get, that we use, that we translate church, is a word called ecclesia. And ecclesia literally means called out. It's a secular term that the church has adopted, but it carries the idea, it refers to a group of people that are called out from the rest of the world because of a united or common set of beliefs or ideals. Brothers and sisters, if we're going to call ourselves the church, if we're going to call ourselves ecclesia, we best be called out of the world. We cannot call ourselves the church if we look like the world does. I appreciate our brother this morning talking about, our brother back there talking about perseverance. Because as the church, we're going to have to persevere. We're going to have to stand out. And as our brother over here mentioned, we're going to look a little bit peculiar. People are going to notice that. And while that does give us an opportunity to be evangelistic, it's going to come at a price. It did for Daniel's friends. Because the problem is that when we stand apart from the world doesn't like it. When everyone but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego took a knee, the world noticed. And look what is said in chapter 3, verse 8. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. That's the world's response to Christians who stand out in the crowd. It's not acceptance and it's not tolerance. It's malice. The world noticed and they didn't like what they saw, and they sought to destroy those who stood out. But I want you to notice something else. Notice that Nebuchadnezzar does not immediately destroy Daniel's friends. The indication seems to be that Daniel's friends have been given advanced warning that if they do not bow down before the golden image, they will be burned in the fiery furnace. They knew ahead of time. So Nebuchadnezzar, as king, has every right to immediately order their execution. That's not what Nebuchadnezzar does. Notice what he does. He gives them a second chance to fall down before the golden image. Because that's what Satan does. Certainly, Satan's not losing any sleep over destroying Christians, but why destroy Christians physically when you can destroy them spiritually? That's what Nebuchadnezzar seeks to do. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't just want to physically corrupt or destroy these men. He wants to spiritually corrupt them. He wants them to conform, and so he puts more pressure. He gives them a second opportunity to compromise. Brothers and sisters, that had to be a very tempting offer. Here you are, you've already had to make the bold choice to stand out amongst the crowd, and now you're being brought before the king and threatened with punishment. It was vague in general. Anyone who doesn't bow before the golden image goes to the fiery furnace. Now it's specific. You don't bow before the golden image, you go to the fiery furnace. That's the way the world operates. You need to conform to us. You need to be like us. Everyone needs to just be accepting until you don't. And then it's, you have to be like me. You have to accept me. It was anyone that doesn't conform needs to be canceled or done away with. They don't need to have a voice any longer. Now it's, you don't conform, you get canceled, you get rejected. They're given a second chance, but with that second chance, the threat goes from being a general and vague threat to a very specific one. And I got to be honest, I wouldn't be all that shocked or surprised to hear that Daniel's friends gave into it. What a challenging threat, but that's not what they do because they have resolve. It's what it all comes back to. It all comes back to chapter 1, verse 28. Daniel and his friends have resolve. And so they tell Nebuchadnezzar, it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what you threat. And notice, Nebuchadnezzar asks, what God is going to pull you out of this situation? Who are you going to turn to save you? Nebuchadnezzar fully expects the answer to that to be no one. There's no one greater than your God, Nebuchadnezzar. No one can save me. But that's not their response. Their response is that Yahweh can. Yahweh can save me from your hand. Yahweh can deliver me. There's nothing you can do that Yahweh can't undo. But even if he doesn't, even if God doesn't step in, I'm still not going to bow down to your golden image. I would rather die than be corrupted. I would rather suffer physical pain and physical death than spiritual death, spiritual condemnation. That's the response of Daniel and his friends to a world that seeks to strip them of their religious identity. But brothers and sisters, if we're going to make the same assertion that Daniel's friends made, we're going to have the same resolve. If we're going to have the boldness to stand up and say, I'll go to the fiery furnace before I fall before your golden image, then we're going to have the same resolve. Daniel and his friends have boldness because of a resolve to live a sinless life. And if you're not doing that, then you can't have that boldness. Brothers and sisters, it's foolish to think that you can live a sinless life and expect God to come to your salvation in times of trial. Daniel and his friends get to make that claim. They get to say, God will deliver me from your hand, Nebuchadnezzar, because I'm living for God. I'm obeying God. But if you're not, you don't get that claim. You don't get that hope and that assurance. Daniel and his friends have resolve because of a life committed to living sinlessly. They have boldness because of a resolve not to be defiled by the things of this world. Daniel and his friends get to have that boldness because they have an assurance that as followers of God, regardless of what happens in this earthly life, there's a better home waiting. A home far better, one that would make any amount of earthly pain and torment so worth it. So very, very worth it. For the faithful Christian, that same hope exists. This world can cancel me. They can ruin me financially. They can torment me. They can vandalize my property. They can hurt me. They can hurt my family. They can destroy me. But they can't take away my eternal destination. They don't get to touch heaven. They're very limited. And I get to have hope that regardless of what happens to me in this life, heaven's going to be so much worth it. So very worth it. Nothing that they can do to Daniel and his friends will cause them to compromise their faith because they're hoping for something better. You can take me away from my home. You can take away my language. You can take away my diet. You can take away whatever you want, but I'm not bowing the knee before this golden image. That's a hope that's only offered to a faithful Christian that's resolved not to be defiled. But that's a resolve that's going to lead to trial. So far, Daniel's friends have talked big talk. Now it's time for them to put their money where their mouth is. They've claimed that they're willing to go to the fiery furnace and that God will deliver them. But can they do it? Look at verses 19 and following. The Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the fiery furnace be heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks and their tunics and their hats and other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, the furnace overheated, and the flames of the fire killed those who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fiery furnace?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." And he said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like the son of a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace and declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the straps and prefects and governors and king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their head was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of the fire had come upon them. Then Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than service and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any peoples, nations, or languages that speak anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, their house laid in ruins. For there is no God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make the claim to Nebuchadnezzar that Yahweh, their God, can deliver them from the fiery furnace. And while that statement is certainly true, it's not exactly what ends up happening. While God certainly can prevent Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from having to go into the fiery furnace, it's not what he does. Brothers and sisters, know that God certainly can prevent bad things from happening to you. But that's not always what he's going to do. God never promised that we will never have to go to the fiery furnace. He does, however, promise deliverance in the fire. There will probably be times, and in fact, there probably already have been times in your Christian walk when you face the fiery furnace. There may be times in life when you suffer because you have resolved not to be defiled. But it was in the fiery furnace that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego found salvation. And it may be the case that your salvation comes in the midst of your trials. The text tells us that there was a fourth person that appeared in that fire. And there's a little bit of room for interpretation as to who that fourth being was. Some scholars believe that it was the pre-incarnated Christ. Nebuchadnezzar makes the claim that the appearance of the fourth person was like the son of a god. Later in the text, he's referred to as an angel or a messenger. Well, that description can be used to describe Christ. It's not always. So there's some room for interpretation there. But the point is this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were standing in a fiery furnace, having seen the damage that it had done to those who threw them in, having been through the ringer, having stood before the king. Here they are standing in the fiery furnace. They're in the midst of the trial, and God sends someone to minister to them. God is with them in the fire. God gives them salvation in the fire. He promises the same thing to us. It's not that we won't ever go through trials. In fact, not only can I not promise a life free from trials, I find it my responsibility to warn you, if you wear the name Christian, if you call yourself a part of the church, you're going to suffer for it. The world is going to hate you. We're told they hated our master, they will hate us. I can't promise you an easy life. I want to, but I can't. I can't promise you that trials won't come, but I can promise you this. God will be with you in those fires. God will provide salvation for you in those fires. It's in our trials that we find Christ. You see, these three men were never more like their Savior than they were in the moment that they made the choice to give up their earthly life for a home in heaven. Isn't that what Jesus did? Did Jesus not give himself up, give up his earthly life, and suffer a painful, agonizing death because he was not willing to compromise and to give in to the wishes and the demands of the Jews? Jesus stood for God, and he wasn't willing to give that up. And he went to the cross for it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood for God. They weren't willing to give that up, and they went to the furnace for it. Brothers and sisters, if you stand for God, trials are going to come. They're going to be tough days. But just as God raised his son from the dead, just as God sent his messenger to minister to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God promises that he's going to be there for you. He doesn't promise that you won't have trials, but he does promise that from those trials will come salvation. And ultimately, perhaps the most significant thing to come from the resolve of Daniel and Daniel's friends is that their resolve resulted in Nebuchadnezzar blessing the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want you to see a pattern here. Notice what happens when God's children resolve not to be defiled. Turn with me to chapter 1 of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 17. Daniel and his friends resolved not to be defiled by the food that the king ate and the drink that he drank. And notice how the chapter ends. As for these four youth, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom, understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in the kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel and his friends resolved not to be defiled by the king's food. Daniel and his friends are exalted. They're promoted. Then look at chapter 2. Daniel and his friends resolve to turn to God in the face of perilous situation. And notice how chapter 2 ends, starting in verse 26. Starting in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering of incense be offered to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you've been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king that he appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. Notice, chapter 1, Daniel and his friends have resolve. They're exalted. Chapter 2, Daniel and his friends have resolve. They're exalted, and God is exalted through them. Daniel chapter 3, Daniel's friends have resolve. They're exalted, and God is exalted through them. Do you see the pattern here? When God's children stand up for him, when they have resolved not to be defiled, they're exalted, and God is exalted through them. Brothers and sisters, make no mistake. As I previously mentioned, trials are going to come. I can't promise that you will be exalted in this life. You may not gain the fame and wealth and notoriety that Daniel and his friends received. God never promises you that. But he does promise that when his son comes, you will be gathered together to sit at his feet in heaven for eternity. And what more could you ask for? What greater reward could there be? When the day of judgment comes, I fully expect that Daniel and his friends will say that nothing God gave them during their time in Babylon had anything on what they receive in heaven. Brothers and sisters, when you stand up for God, you will be exalted. And more importantly, God will be exalted through you. But all that comes from a sense of resolve. To conclude my third lesson in this series on the book of Daniel and the life of Daniel and his friends, I hope that you can see that God is at work in their lives. I hope you understand that the God that Daniel and his friends served is the same God that we serve today. And more importantly, I hope that you understand that when you are resolved not to be defiled by things of this world, you become more and more like your Savior, who more than anyone else embodied what it meant to be resolved not to be defiled. And through your actions, those around you get a glimpse of God. And what an honor it is to be the lens through which those around you get to see our Savior. It is my hope and my challenge to you that you will live this week in such a way that embodies resolve, that you will live in such a way that those around you see God through your actions, that you live in such a way that through your life and your deeds, God will be exalted by those who maybe didn't know him at the time. But in order for you to accept that challenge, you first have to resolve not to be defiled. There's a standing invitation for anyone who needs help in strengthening their resolve. Maybe the case this morning that you've not put on Christ in baptism yet. Maybe it's time. Maybe it's time to develop a sense of resolve and to make that commitment. If that be the case, then we certainly want to help you do that. But it's maybe more likely that you've done that. You've put on Christ in baptism, but you find that you've wavered in your resolve. This morning you have an opportunity. We as your brothers and sisters in Christ want nothing more than to help you strengthen and deepen your resolve. And you can do that this morning. If you need prayers of the church, if you need any help or assistance from us, we want nothing more than to be of assistance. If there's anything that we can do for you this morning, please come as we stand and sing.